Good afternoon and welcome. I wanted to show you some legacy C. Now, some C compilers use the old standards, which means there's more rules that you have to follow, and they were removed and replaced with better standards. So, for example, in certain versions of the C language, you will have an error or a warning if you define variables underneath function calls or even if statements. Now, in old style C, variables have to be declared at the top. They have to. So that's an important thing to note right there. How you get around this with an old compiler is you can do things like this. So by putting those two braces, anything you define here will count as a new scope, so it'll work. The same applies for if statements. So this would be legal, but this would not. So the new scope basically resets the rules and allows you to define variables at the start of the scope, but it has to be at the top of the scope. So that's basically an important rule in old style C, is that variables have to be declared at the top of a scope. So make sure you remember that. There's ways to get around these rules, which I'll show you later in a moment. The next thing I want to show you is, I showed you for loops recently, right? On certain versions of C, you can't do it like this. You have to instead do it like this. I know it's quite silly, right? That's why it was replaced with a better standard. In the newer versions of C, you can do it like that and there's no problem. So if you wanted to be able to access newer functionality and your compiler's complaining, you could always try and change your standard on the compiler. If it's a modern compiler, it might be using older versions by default. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. When you go to compile your program, you essentially go to compile it like normal, and then you do std for standard, C standard basically, equals C11. And that should push you back up to the newer standards. However, if your compiler is legacy, it might not know about standard C11, in which case look for the highest standard for your compiler you can, or replace your compiler with a complete new one. So yeah, I hope that covers legacy C, because that was quite important to get across.